All right, we are going to be working on chapter 14 in this video. So we are in the final unit of instruction here for the course, and we do hit chapter 14, which covers these topics. So I just want to kind of zoom in on those just for a second. And we're going to talk about JavaScript and what JavaScript is. A really important aspect of working with JavaScript, which is working with what we call the DOM, or the Document Object Model. We're going to learn how to do alerts, and that's really kind of all it takes in this class to kind of earn the JavaScript points. What do we use JavaScript for? And then ultimately, we start talking about JavaScript libraries, and one of the real notable ones called jQuery, which is, the other big takeaway. jQuery, in fact, is so popularly used, we just kind of almost think of it as JavaScript now, but it is actually a separate library. And once again, all the solutions for all the case studies and stuff here are on Prometheus, including examples of the completed, both jQuery and JavaScript versions of all the case studies. Just a reminder, if you need any of the files or resources, audio, video, code, whatever, you can get all the assets basically for the projects from these zip files for any of the case studies. Any of the stuff that I'm going to be doing here in class, I noticed I did not really post anything last week, so I'm going to be correcting Unit 8 and then hopefully adding my Unit 9 stuff here too for in-class examples. And all of that, remember, all the solutions for all the case studies are here. All you have to simply do is go to the author's version, right-click, view source, and you have basically the answers, right? Really pretty important, though, whenever you step forward to the next chapter and you're building your case study, that your previous case study is exactly correct for the current one to work correctly. You guys should know that all by now, but just in case you forgot, all the solutions are provided right here on Prometheus. There's also a copy on Apollo as well, so either link that you have. All right, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint here, and I'm going to get started on this content. And the chapter title is A Brief Look at JavaScript and jQuery, and that's exactly what it is. What I did say earlier today in the course for people that are registering for next semester, after you've taken this first web programming class, one of the next logical follow-up classes is the JavaScript class, where we go in depth into that technology. And so if you have not registered for spring classes yet, that's a next logical course. Other logical courses that follow this one would be the PHP class, the database class. If you haven't taken Python or Java 1 yet, you should take those. And then if you've kind of done a lot of those already, advanced web programming would be a follow-up to this. But advanced web programming does require the JavaScript course before you can take it. So you can't just go from web programming to advanced web programming. JavaScript is a requirement, absolutely. It might even be another course or two in there that you have to take, perhaps databases as well. All right, so the objectives for this chapter are as follows. Well, let's figure out what JavaScript even is, why we use it on web pages, some of the tools. We'll also look at this thing called the DOM, the Document Object Model, very, very important in web work to understand what that is. We'll learn how to do some really simple JavaScript code using alerts, which basically create pop-ups. We'll take a look at like variables and some of the language conventions for JavaScript. Won't go very deep into it, but just a really kind of brief overview. We'll look at form validation scripts. That was one of the big things that we did in the past with JavaScript, was to validate form content. Real big, in fact, still important, but HTML5's taken some of that away, but it's still considered a good usage. Then we'll go into jQuery, and jQuery is basically a library of JavaScript functions that allows us to use shorter, more convenient syntax to use JavaScript actions, and very, very popular, to the point where jQuery is kind of just considered JavaScript in a way, right? So we use that kind of interchangeably with JavaScript. All right. Let's start first with what the heck is JavaScript? Well, What it is basically is it's a language that's built in to our web browsers. And so they say here it's an object-based scripting language, which is true. So you can do what we call object-oriented programming. And in fact, what's true about JavaScript is that it is an object-based language that has that at its core, you know. So a lot of the syntax that we use for JavaScript is built upon the fact that there's a lot of APIs built into JavaScript. So for example, your web browser has a bunch of stuff built into it, and often you're just leveraging these pre-built tools to create things in JavaScript. And also when you build things inside of JavaScript, you can kind of, once you've built it, refer to things by one simple little convenient name to access all of its capabilities. And that's because of how JavaScript is built. We call that dot notation, by the way, and you'll see that as you kind of move forward. What's kind of fun about JavaScript is by its inception, the JavaScript language works inside of our web browser. This is kind of weird, right? Because when you learn other programming languages, like if you learn Python or Java, for example, with Java, you got to install a bunch of stuff. With Python, you got to do the same thing. You got to like install the language libraries, install an IDE to code it, and then, you know, hopefully it works correctly, you know, and then you can create your programs. With JavaScript, well, all you need is a text editor and a browser. And you know what? The browsers are already installed on your system, and there are ways to code JavaScript directly in your browser. In fact, that might be one of the first ways you learn how to do JavaScript, is to just bring up your browser and do it. So for example, you know, here I have a browser window, how convenient, but I'm going to open up a blank tab. And maybe it's better to go to like one of my own pages here rather than Google. But if I right click and do an inspect, that brings up this side panel, right? And the side panel is pretty helpful. In fact, what a lot of people don't realize about the side panel is it doesn't have to be on the side. You could put it on the bottom, right? So you saw how I do that. You just go to the toolbar here, and wherever you pick, so it can go on the left, you know, it can come over, back over to the right, it goes to the bottom, and depending on which browser you're using, the default for it will vary. I tend to like mine on the right. The other thing that you can do is you can also break out the inspect panel as a separate window. And when you're doing JavaScript work, that can be handy. So you can take this whole panel and move it over to screen number 2 if you have one, or you can go full screen with it, and it's still associated to the same browser tab. Now, the part that we use when we do JavaScript, you know, we're not going to necessarily be looking at the HTML document or the CSS stuff that's computed or programmed in. Instead, we'll be looking at what we call the console. All right, well, that's really exciting. There's nothing here, right? In fact, it's blank. Well, it is blank because we don't have any JavaScript in our program. But if I wrote JavaScript for my web page and there was a problem with it, this is where my errors would appear, you know, so here. The other thing that's kind of interesting about a console is, you know, you can see this, it's flashing, it's like a command prompt. I can just run JavaScript code right here at the prompt. So this is really weird. And you can try this if you want, but I'm just going to go ahead and type 2 plus 2. And I didn't even press enter yet, and you can see, and I'm going to zoom in, the console already responded. The moment I press enter, it actually runs the code and gives me the output. The output is 4. Okay. That's not very exciting, but what you can do here with JavaScript in the console is you can write JavaScript code and try it and see how it works. Now, for those of you that have learned Python, so some people will be in the Python class at the same time, this is very similar to the Python console. And the correlation that exists between Python and JavaScript is that both are what we called interpreted languages. In other words, you write a command and you execute it. You don't have to compile it, right? If you think about your Java class, if you have that class, you write your code, you run it through the debugger and the compiler, and it only runs if there's no errors, right? But it compiles to executable code first and then executes. Here, that doesn't happen. So we can actually write code directly here and see the results immediately. So that's one of the reasons why we have a console. We'll come back to the console a little bit later, but I just want to kind of introduce you to it. What's fun about JavaScript is JavaScript gives you the ability to add programming code to your web pages. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So what can I add my code to? Well, you can add code to the entire window. So for example, you can write JavaScript that opens a new window or a new tab or closes the window or closes the tab, right? You can also write JavaScript that affects the stuff on the document. So for example, I can say that I want to load a different document. So if I'm on one page, I can write JavaScript that loads another page. Well, that sounds like a link. Yes. Yeah, link operates the same way. But I can write JavaScript code to do that relative to what a user does. So for example, if I go to a web page and I log in and the username and password are correct, I can write JavaScript that brings up a different window automatically or a different document or web page automatically. So I can do things with the document. For example, like I can look at the history of a document, so I can go backwards, or I can move people to a new page with it. The other thing, and probably the more common usage of JavaScript, is to actually manipulate the stuff that's on the page. So I can use JavaScript to make things appear or disappear, or if I have an object on the screen, like an image, I can make it animate, or I can make it jump around or fade in or fade out or do things, basically. So that's why we use JavaScript. Where does it come from? Well, it hasn't been around forever. In fact, it's kind of on the newer end of languages. When we first had web browsers, graphical web browsers, was back in the early 90s. And in the early 90s, the original web browser was a browser called Mosaic. And the people that developed that original browser, Mosaic, later went on to commercially develop a product called Netscape. And that was the precursor to Firefox. So before Firefox was Firefox, for a short period it was Mozilla, but before that it was called Netscape, and it was a private company. It was free software, right? So their whole game was they would develop the web browser for free, and then if you wanted to, if they wanted to earn money, basically they would sell the server version of Netscape to create web server software, basically. But they realized pretty quickly with a web browser when they developed it that this is really cool. We can put stuff on the screen. People can click on stuff. We've got images. We can put CSS on here. But man, this is kind of boring. It's not doing anything, right? And the exciting part about being on the web is all the actions that happen when you go to a web page, right? JavaScript brings that capability to put action on a web page. When Netscape originally developed their own scripting language, they called it LiveScript. All right, great. They weren't the only ones making web browsers, though. And so what happened is Microsoft was also making web browsers at the time, and Opera was making a web browser, and there was others, and believe it or not, there were more than one, company out there. But Netscape and Microsoft were the two big ones. Of course, Microsoft decided, we need a scripting language too, but we're not going to call it LiveScript. Eventually, the people at Netscape kind of partnered up with the people at Sun Microsystems, and Sun Microsystems was the company that originally developed Java as a programming language. And so they collaborated with Netscape on some of the syntax. So you will notice some correlations. If you look at the Java programming language has curly brackets and semicolons to kind of define their structures. JavaScript does too, right? And that was very common in C-style languages. So the thinking was, well, Java's really popular, C and C++ are really popular. So if we have a syntax that looks like one of those, this will be more popular. So JavaScript basically grew from LiveScript, but they just renamed it, and they renamed it JavaScript because of that collaboration. But the real big thing that you learn is when you both learn Java and JavaScript is not Java, even though it looks kind of the same. And Java is not JavaScript, even though it kind of looks the same. The thinking really was back then that they used the name Java in it because Java was really popular, and they thought by using JavaScript in the name, they would make JavaScript popular, And you know what? JavaScript became popular anyhow just because we have web browsers. They really didn't need a separate name. Interesting to note, though, that Microsoft had its own version called JScript that had its own syntax, by the way. And eventually, it took a little while, and W3 Schools had to step in and say, well, you guys have JavaScript, you guys have JScript, we got to kind of merge these. They've got to be the same thing. And so if you knew you were writing for a Microsoft browser in the old days, you'd use JScript. If you knew you were writing for Netscape, you used JavaScript. Kind of a messy situation. It only took a few years for them to work that out. By the end of the 90s, JavaScript was firmly in place and the language of choice. What's kind of fascinating about JavaScript is we do think of it as a full-blown programming language, but in truth, it is not. It is not a language that's used to build computer programs in the traditional sense. In other words, programs that run on top of Windows or the Mac OS or Linux operating system. So JavaScript, has a bunch of different uses. Okay, so here's some really common things we use it for. To put a message on the screen. So when you go to a website and you get a pop-up, thank you, JavaScript. It's JavaScript. Usually that's creating the pop-up, and allows you to push that content in front. Another thing that happens is that if you ever go to a website and you see a menu, and I'm just thinking of one here. I don't know if they actually do it this way, but Amazon's like one of those companies. Like if you're on Amazon and you're shopping, and they have like these menus that pop up, and they're really kind of complicated menus, right? A lot of times, all those actions, like if you go to just Amazon and then you start searching products, you start going into these areas, that is often done with like these panels that pop up, the sub menus, the hover effects. And I'm not seeing any on the top level anymore, but like it used to be like if you'd click on these, you get a big drop down and then it would expand. But like expander menus are often done that way. So when they say select list navigation, in the old days, that's how we do a lot of it. It is possible to do a lot of that now with CSS, by the way, so a lot of people prefer the CSS approach. Another thing that you can do is if you are filling out forms on a web page, JavaScript is really good at editing and validating the content that you put into a form to make sure it's correct. So for example, if you go to a website and you're asked to enter a username and a password, and the password will have a stipulation. Hey, it's got to be 8 characters. You got to have an uppercase letter. You got to have some numbers in there. You got to have a special character. Usually that's JavaScript that's making sure that's correct. And then when you type one in and you get an error message that comes back, that's JavaScript usually handling it. Another thing that you can do with JavaScript, create a new window or new tab with a certain size and screen position. So not only can you create those, but you can just create a new tab, put the person in the tab if you wish, or you create a new window, make it a certain size, put it in the top right corner of the screen. You can do that with JavaScript. Another thing that JavaScript, especially historically, was very heavily used for was doing image rollovers. So like you would have this effect where I would move my mouse over a picture and the picture changes or fades or becomes something else. That's JavaScript. Or have you ever been on a website where you're maybe moving your mouse around and the image changes or animates because of your mouse movement? That's often done with JavaScript. Status messages. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Did you ever go to a website and you log in? Like if I went to Facebook right now and typed facebook.com, I'm either going to go to their login screen, or maybe I'm already logged in and my page just comes up and it knows who I am. Well, how does that happen? Well, JavaScript is usually doing that. It's reading information from your local computer, recognizing you're still logged in, puts you into your account and gives you a little status message at the top, that shows your profile, for example. How does it know to do that? Well, JavaScript is the magic sauce. JavaScript also has the capability to read your system date and time. So, so you might log into an international website, but it recognizes that you're on Central Time in Wisconsin and what the time is and the date. That's the JavaScript. The other thing that JavaScript can do is it can do math, just like a regular programming language. And if you guys haven't figured that out, that's one of the big things that programming languages do, is do mathematical calculations or comparisons or analysis, that kind of thing. So that brings that capability to a web page. So that's huge, right? Because I can't do that with CSS or HTML, right? HTML puts stuff on the screen. CSS controls how it looks and maybe a little bit of movement and animation and stuff, but it really does not do any math. JavaScript brings that capability. The moment that you bring the capability of doing math and logic on a web page, well, now you have the difference between a web page and a web application. So when you start adding JavaScript to your web pages, now you're really building a web application, and why we call it web programming, because you're not only putting stuff on the screen, you're making it do something. Okay, now gets to the point where we actually start coding JavaScript, and there's kind of a couple different ways to add JavaScript to a page, right? So that you can add JavaScript like CSS directly to a web page. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a couple of things here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my my coding engine. I'm using Dreamweaver for doing this, and you can use whatever tool you want. I am also going to drop to my file folders here and bring up a file folder, and I'm going to kind of follow kind of my normal patterns for doing this work. I store everything on my Google Drive, so that's my G drive here. And in my later iterations for this class, I'm actually putting stuff on my Prometheus folder, web programming, unit, whatever. And right now we're actually working on unit 9, right? So I'm going to make a copy of my most recent folder, and I'm looking, any of these have images or media or anything like that? They don't. Okay. So unit 6 here, and I'm going to kind of copy this whole folder structure. So I don't mean to bounce around so much, but we're going to make a copy. We're going to paste it back in. We're going to call this, I didn't do a lot of coding last week, so I'm going to call this unit 9. That'll be adequate, and we'll show all the different things. But that is a copy of unit 6 in progress. All right. Back over to Dreamweaver, I'm just going to do a little bit of a refresh here. We don't want to do a sync, we just want to refresh. So I'm just going to right click in here and refresh. Oh, right here, they move the refresh button. All right, so now you should be able to see some of this stuff. Oh, that's kind of interesting, because I do have a unit 7 here that maybe never made it to my folder. Okay, so that's okay. I probably should have copied that one. In fact, here's the beautiful thing about working here instead of Dreamweaver is I can do file management here as well. So I'm going to copy unit 7, and then I'm going to paste it back in. So I should have a unit 7 copy. I am noticing that this is not necessarily finding. Oh, I see. So I'm on my C account, not my A account. All right. So that's the why I'm not seeing it. So I'm gonna. All right. So that's okay, right? But I'm still gonna name that one. I'm gonna do a rename, and I'm gonna call that unit 9. So I was looking at the wrong folder before, and we'll call that unit 9. Don't update is what I'm going to say here. So now I have a copy to work from to do my work. And I'm going to go ahead and close all the pages I have open here in the editor. And the reason I'm doing that, they're from a different folder. I don't want to confuse myself that I think I'm doing my work and I'm not, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm working on the right version. So I'm in Unit 9. In fact, I'm not really sure where I'm going to do this work. I don't want to do this necessarily on the home page. So, maybe a good idea is I want to do a live preview of this. I want to see this web page. So let's go back to the file folder here. I'm actually in the C account. So I'm going to go back. So here we are on the C account. And there's my web. There's my Unit 9. I just want to take a look where I'm at right now. So I'm just going to open up the website and just look around, right? So just to kind of remember where I'm at. So there's the home page, whatever. There's my about page. That's also a whatever, right? My dragons page. There's my tables. I have the king. There's my audio and video, multimedia, iframes, right? And then I have my contact page, which, if I fill it out and hit subscribe, has my thank you page and my automatic, and there's some JavaScript here. Remember, I said you could copy this JavaScript that takes me back to the home page. Right, so I'm trying to think of a place. Where's a good place to try out my JavaScript? And I'm kind of thinking maybe in my about page will be a good page. So this is the reason why I brought this up. I just want to throw some JavaScript on there just for the sake of it. And I certainly don't want to annoy people on my home page with a pop-up, because that's ultimately what I'll probably do, at least in the short term. So the about page becomes a good page for doing a little bit of experimenting with JavaScript. So I'm going to come over here then and open up my about page inside of my editor. So whatever tool you're using to get to that point. If you're using a higher level tool, okay, so Notepad++ is a little primitive. Visual Studio Code's maybe a little higher level, and they do allow you to kind of look at your files. You might also be using brackets. But we're at the point in the class now that as we start to go into JavaScript stuff, this is where you might want to think about maybe a little bit higher level tool, right? And so, and I kind of closed my browser window, which I didn't want to do. So here's where I take people to this website, jetbrains.com. And I think I've mentioned this one before as like a good place where you can get some good IDEs. But where I always start here, if you don't have an account here first, you want to get an account. So I go to the search window and I type education or student or something like that. And notice how they have JetBrains for education, right? Right. And they have free access to professional tools and free educational licenses for students and teachers. So I take advantage of this myself. And what you should do is, if you haven't done this yet, is to apply now. Use your Gateway email account to apply, and then afterwards you get basically a free account. Once your account is established, then download software. Don't download it first, because it's more of a pain the other direction. So apply for the account first, get the free account. They'll send you all the information. Then once you have that free account, then you can come back to the master website here, go to the developer tools, and the tool that you might want to consider downloading here is what we call WebStorm, which is their web IDE. It's designed for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can also do other web languages in here. So very likely, if you take the JavaScript class in the spring, this is why I bring it up, or if you're working in the advanced web programming class, your instructor will likely ask you to do this. And as a preferred IDE, WebStorm is one that does JavaScript coding very beautifully. Another really cool aspect of WebStorm, is that it also has a built-in FTP tool. So you can do your JavaScript in there, HTML, CSS, and FTP, all right from the same interface, kind of like what I'm doing in Dreamweaver, right? It's a little more powerful tool, more elegant to look at. Another tool that you might look at here is this one, PHP Storm, which is really a great tool for writing PHP code if you're taking the PHP class. PyCharm, which is a Python IDE, so if you're taking the Python class, that's a really good one. Or their big application, which is called IntelliJ IDEA, built for Java, but IntelliJ IDEA does all the others as well. So that's like the big product for JetBrains is IntelliJ. So if you're looking for one, you can get that. You can download them all separately. They don't interfere with each other. And when you have the specific versions, they're a little bit more lightweight, load faster, etc. if you're doing specific work. Notice they have a bunch of other tools, but WebStorm is a JavaScript IDE. It's built for that. So in fact, if I click on it, you'll notice here's the pitch for it. The smartest JavaScript IDE. Okay, I'm not going to be demonstrating that here, by the way, but I just want to point it out to you because if you take that class, chances are they're going to make you load this up anyhow. So this is an awesome product. A lot of professional developers use it to do JavaScript work. So really, some really cool features. It has like the ability to preview in a browser, FTP, IntelliSense for JavaScript, and the debugging for JavaScript all built right in, so you don't have to figure out your errors in your browser. You can figure them out here. Okay, so that's kind of my big suggested product for that aspect. For us, we are going to use Dreamweaver, and the slide that we're on right now, so I'm kind of wrangling us back to the thing. A couple different ways that you can do this is you can place JavaScript directly between script tags in your page. Now, if you remember when we were doing this with style sheets, one of the first way we learned to do styles, for example, is you would add a style tag at the top of your document, open and close it, and then whatever styles, you'd switch to CSS language here. So if I wanted to do body and then do, I don't know, background color or something like that, you would just type up your code, add the code here, right? And you're done. JavaScript can be done the same way. So in the head section, and this is important, or preferred really, is that you do this in the head section of your document, is you write a script tag, and then everything in between these script tags is JavaScript code. So the first example that most often you do for JavaScript is you do an alert, and then you add parentheses behind it, and then inside of double quotes, you do this. And with a JavaScript command, like in a real programming language, by the way, you have to end each command with a semicolon. So that would be an example of a script. Now, does it have to be, the question we get, does it have to be in the head section of the document? The truth is with JavaScript, no. The same is true with CSS. So you can actually put script or style tags anywhere. That's just the preferred place to put it. You will very commonly see coders adding script tags right in the middle of their HTML. Real common to put it like, right in like the body section of something sometimes. Or what some coders do is they'll put their scripts at the bottom, sometimes below the HTML tag. Not recommended, by the way, but you can do that. But more likely right before the closing of body and HTML tags. So like not unusual to see script tags here. And why? So the question is, why do you do that? All right. Sometimes you want your page to load up first and then have your scripts run, where if the script is at the top, and it's affecting content on the page, it's a good idea to get the content on the page first and then run the script to change the content, not to change the content before it ever hits the page, if that makes any sort of sense. But more commonly, you'll see a script here, right? So this is if you are adding it to the page, this would be an embedded JavaScript, right, or inline. I'm going to actually go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and go back to the browser now where I had that page open somewhere, right? So here it is. And when I run this, watch what happens. Yeah, this is the JavaScript right here. This page says, oh, hi there, right? So this is your JavaScript alert. And I have a choice. I can click OK or nothing, right? And until I click OK, I don't see my page, right? So that's an example of a really super basic script. And believe it or not, that's about how complicated the chapter 14 work is for the case studies. It's really that simple. Same thing you can do for your final project, and you can earn 1 extra credit point on the project, 2 extra credit points on the case study if you add that incorrectly. All right. The other thing that they're bringing up in the slideshow here is it is also possible to take JavaScript code and add it as an event attached to an HTML element. So in other words, I can trigger JavaScript by somebody hovering over something or clicking on something. So for example, if I have an image on a page and I add JavaScript to it, if somebody clicks on it, something happens. That is a technique. Now that is maybe not the smartest way to do this, but it is something that is possible. We usually kind of, I'm going to say, discourage people from doing that approach because it makes for really messy code. It does. You know, you're better off ultimately either putting it in the script tags or putting it in an external file. So I want you to notice a commonality here between CSS and JavaScript. I can add JavaScript code, for example, directly to this link. And I can say something like on mouse, down, which means the click of the mouse. I can trigger, for example, an event. So I could say, I could put my JavaScript alert here. So when somebody clicks the menu for home, they get an alert box first. Okay, I think that's kind of annoying, right? But you could do it, right? And so that's one approach. That would be inline JavaScript. Highly not recommended, by the way, but you can do it. It's kind of a legacy feature. The other thing that you can do is you can do the embedded, which is you put it either in the head section or really anywhere on your document, right? That works. A script tag that performs an action. That's called an embedded JavaScript. But ultimately, even though that's kind of the easy example to try to begin with, what we do prefer is that you have a separate external file that where the JavaScript is, and you link to it just like you do with the CSS document. So 3 forms: inline, embedded, or external. External is preferred. Embedded is the next choice. And the one that really should be avoided ideally is don't put stuff directly on tags unless you really, really have to, and there's not going to be a lot of scenarios for that. Right. So that's kind of understanding how that works. I will have you notice here that when they put this script tag here, they included a type command, which implies that there's more than one type, right? So there actually are. So if you go to like a tool like a Dreamweaver where I can add here a type, and then I click that, here's some of the types that are available. Right. Notice that you can still call JScript, which is the old Microsoft thing, should never be needed, or ECMA script, which is actually the formal name for JavaScript, is really ECMA script. But they consider these basically not necessary. But if you are running multiple script types on a document, super rare, by the way, but it's possible, right, that you would declare what type this is to keep it from getting confused. If you do add a type, most often it'll be this. So this is kind of considered the formal correct way to do it. But the reality is, if you exclude the type, JavaScript is implied. So for the most part, we really don't worry about that. In older versions of HTML, so if you ever have to deal with legacy pages, so like I'm thinking like XHTML or older, so HTML4, HTML3 or 2 or 1, the type sometimes is required to make a page work, depending on your doc type. If your doc type is straight HTML, like mine is up here, you just say you can just skip it. Basically, it'll just work. If it's any other type, it's a good idea to say type JavaScript like this, and it's text/JavaScript. Right. You know what? I'll leave it there. Really pretty irrelevant, but important to note. All right, moving on. We have to go to this important topic whenever you start doing JavaScript. I will tell you that when you get to your JavaScript course, this is a huge topic of discussion and really, really important in terms of how you do things. What I find fascinating about talking about JavaScript when you first get introduced to it is it brings you, this is kind of a chart, I think, of what you can do with JavaScript in a tree fashion. So JavaScript, in other words, and I'm looking at this graphic here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this graphic bigger, so we can look at it a little more comfortably. Is JavaScript can affect any one of these boxes. Okay, so it starts with the window. So when we think of the window, it's like, okay, I launched my browser window, right? So it's Chrome, Safari, Edge, Firefox, Opera, Brave, whatever browser you're using. There's a new one out there I've been reading a lot about too, and I don't know if you guys have heard about this one called Arc, and a lot of people really kind of like that, so maybe we'll take a look at that in a little while. But when we bring up that browser, it sits in a window. We have the ability with JavaScript to manipulate that window, including opening a new one or closing the current one. So that's pretty primitive, but we can do that. We can also, related to that window, we can follow this branch, and I'm going to start out actually all the way over here on the right. We can also tell which browser it is. So we can run JavaScript code that probes the browser and basically asks the question, which browser are you using, right? And the response will be, Chrome, right? And that's technically referred to as WebKit, as a formal name, for whatever reason. And there's a whole bunch of browsers that fit in that category now, including Edge. So Edge, Safari, Chrome, Brave, all of those are what we call WebKit browsers, because they use the Chrome code base, and that's known as WebKit. So you can actually probe your browser when a person visits your website and see which browser they're using and which version. So if you're using Chrome, in which version of Chrome. Why is that important? Because in the old days, we don't worry about this as much now, but in the old days, if somebody was coming to your website with Internet Explorer and it was a certain version, we knew that certain versions had certain problems, so we would give them different CSS or different JavaScript, partially. So that's kind of interesting. Another big reason this is used is to build statistics. So when you run analytics on a website to see how much traffic you get, this is part of the analytics. Okay, which browser are they using? Hey, 80% of the people are using Chrome. We should design for Chrome, that kind of thing. If you're on a Mac platform, probably going to be real heavy on Safari, but that's important to know when you're designing pages what you should design for, right? All right. The other thing that we can manipulate is location. Now, this is really interesting because I actually used this on my House of the Dragon site. So when I was looking at the code here, so when I did my contact form, right, my contact form, its action tag would take me to the thank you page. So I have a separate thank you page, and when I open that up, I want you to notice here that one of the things I was able to change via a script, JavaScript, was the location of the browser, and all that really means is what page you're on. And this is kind of interesting. So people would fill out the contact form, they end up on my thank you page, you see a little message, and then I have a timer running for 7 seconds that would take me to the home page. So I'm able to change the location of a page with JavaScript. So think about this. In other words, somebody can go to a page that they typed in or clicked on, and then I can either immediately or after a certain amount of time, like I'm doing here, after 7 seconds, take them to a different page. Not unusual when you go to some websites. Hey, click here for whatever, and you click there and you think you're going to that page, but in the background they have this script running and the timeout set to 0, meaning the moment you get to this page, take them somewhere else. Have you ever gone to a website and you think you're clicking to go somewhere and you end up on a different page completely and you wonder, how did that happen? I didn't click on this, right? A common technique for people doing malicious sites, for one thing, so like you go to like, for example, pornography site and you click on something and you end up somewhere else that you're not expecting. It's kind of a malicious trick, but it's totally possible with JavaScript to do that, either for positive reasons or negative reasons. And you can see that here, right? Not something you can control as a user. You know, if somebody's taking you to a different page and you can change the location of the page you're being taken to, that's one thing that can happen as well. Another thing that happens pretty commonly in JavaScript, maybe not quite so often, is you can be controlled as to where you go in your history. So if I'm on a one page right now on my screen, I can have a link on the screen that says back to previous page, which is really, it's just looking at your history in your browser and taking you back a certain number of steps, usually back one step. So a real common little code snippet is history -1, which means you're going back one link in your history, or you can set it to -2 or whatever. You can take it to any specific page, even if you know what the page is. But that happens. Not super common, but fairly common enough. What the biggest area of JavaScript is, though, is the direct manipulation of the document itself, the page, or any of the objects on that page. So anything that's an HTML element, it can be, you know, a paragraph or a link or a div or a section, or, you know, think of any tag that you have on an HTML page or any attribute of that tag. So like if you have a style tag added to it or a script tag added to it or whatever, that can be manipulated by JavaScript. So I can take JavaScript and take a tag that's not there right now and add it to the page, or take a tag that's there now and remove it from the page, or change the CSS code for it to change the color, all by virtue of JavaScript. And I think that's super interesting when you start to think about it, that I can do that. So what allows us to do that is this thing called the document object model, where anything that's listed here, right? So the history, the location, the browser, the window, the document, or any tag or object on the page. So it could be, like, for example, like if one image has a source of a certain file, I can write JavaScript to change the source. You know, you can't do that with HTML once the person's already on the page, right? You have to rewrite the page. But with JavaScript, I can write a code that says, click here and you get a different image, but it goes to the same image tag. Very interesting. And really what we're creating is dynamic pages, you know. The accessibility of any of these objects is because of this document object model. The document object model treats any of those page components as an object that can be manipulated, and it does so in real time in your browser. All right. So the whole concept then of what an object is object is a thing or an entity. It can be the browser window or the submit button or the web page document or any of the tags or any of the attributes of that item. Fascinating when you think about it in that regard. When we talk about, you know, JavaScript's capability, we often think about properties, right? So for example, you'll see this like syntax that develops. So for example, if I want to take the document and change the background color of the document, we have a syntax for it. So I can say in JavaScript, document BG color, and make it equal to something, right? Red, blue, hex code, whatever. And there you are. You've changed it in real time with JavaScript without CSS. We are manipulating what is typically a CSS thing, but because JavaScript can manipulate that object, in this case the document, we can do that. We can also write like weird code like this. We can write code that determines when was the last time the web page file was modified. and that will return a snippet of text. Or we can change the image that we're loading up on the screen using that. So that would be a property, and properties look like this. So it'd be like whatever your higher level object is, and then the property, and notice there's no parentheses after. It's a property, meaning it's something that we can adjust. The other thing that we can do is we can also trigger what we call methods or functions, right? So if you already have had some programming, you understand what I'm talking about. A real common one to use in JavaScript is document write. And so I can, for example, write to the document an HTML object. So what would go in between here, you could just put words on the page, or you can actually write an HTML element like a paragraph or whatever, and you write that code back to the document and it makes it appear or whatever, or do whatever it's doing. You can also force a form to submit. So these, whenever you see a command like this and it's followed by parentheses, that basically is indicating to you that you're triggering a built-in function that operates on its own and does a bunch of different actions based upon the code that you're writing. So method or a function, I usually think of them as functions here, but a method or a function is an action that's pre-written that you can execute. A property is something that has value, like the background color of the page is a property. A write method is an action or a method. Now, I can kind of demonstrate a couple of these things, so this is kind of interesting. So I'll bring up my probably my launch page. Vidal, I see you've joined the session. I am going to go back to my launch page here, and I'm using this because this is a really kind of basic HTML page. I am going to right-click and bring up the inspect panel, and I remember I had it like split, and I don't want to do that. I actually want to put it on the sidebar right now on purpose. And the reason I want to do that is we can kind of see, the output and the action at the same time. I am going to go to the console tab. This is where we execute our JavaScript, right? So just to remember, in the console, I can actually type a command. So for example, 2 + 2. And if I run it, it gives me the output. Now, we just looked at a couple of different things, and one of them was document.write. Right, so this is a command where I can write code to the screen, and this is kind of weird because I can create a paragraph, for example, and some words. There it is, and then close my paragraph. And I did forget something here, real frankly, because this is text, right? This has to come inside of double quotes. But you can see what I did is I just wrote an HTML tag here. Now, the moment I press enter on this, it will execute the code, and then you watch the left side of the screen to see what happens. So here goes. There it is. Okay. So what happened is I ended up replacing my entire page contents with the HTML code that I just wrote. And if I right-click view source here now, well, now it goes back to the original thing. What happened, right? Well, the console, and this is the weird thing about working with JavaScript, it supersedes the regular page content. And so, yeah, could I insert, and this is a question you might have, an entire web page in a document write command? And the answer is yes, you can totally do that. And in fact, some web pages are written that way entirely. All right, another example, if I do document.bg color, which is a property, right? So I'm pulling that in. Well, this I would make equal to, and really the correct syntax here is not to do that, but I believe I can just put in a hex code here. What color is that, you guys? Don't all answer at once. It's gray. Oh, so I see. Yeah, so I have to actually enclose this in a class, which I'm not doing. But the possibility here is that I actually apply this directly to a particular object. So really what they want me to do in the syntax is say document.bg color, and then apply that to a particular object in its entirety by name. So I would have to name its class, structure, and then list it. All right. A little beyond the scope of what we're doing here because I really don't want to get that deep with it. All right. So the other thing that JavaScript is used for is to give our web pages the capability that normal programs have. And normal programs, especially in a graphical environment, respond to clicks, or what we call event handlers. And so when I'm on a page, and you think about this, I move my mouse around, I find a link, I click on it, I hover over things, sometimes I make some change. I can also click and drag, or drag and drop, or pinch and zoom, or twist, or whatever, right? Scroll with your fingers or with a mouse or whatever. Those are all actions. And whenever you take an action on a web page, we call this an event. And then we have these special things called event handlers that wait for those events to happen and then respond to them. So for example, these are real common ones that they've listed. Clicking on something is called onClick. That's the event handler. Moving a mouse over something or hovering is called onMouseOver. Moving it away is called onMouseOut. When the page loads, we call that onLoad, or when we leave a page, we call that unload, onUnload. Each one of those can have an action attributed to it. So for example, by virtue of loading a page, on load, we can trigger JavaScript to run. Or if I'm leaving the page, trigger JavaScript to run. Or by moving my mouse around the screen, trigger JavaScript to run. So here's some really common events that we think of, kind of in plain English. And this is what the event handler is called in JavaScript. So onClick, onLoad, onMouseOver, onMouseOut, onSubmit, onUnload. Is that all the event handlers there are in JavaScript? No, this is the most common ones that we use. There are many more, right? And in fact, you can look this up. When you get to your JavaScript class, you'll learn about them in detail. When we think about mobile devices, they have their own, right? So, think about the stuff you do on your phone. Touch, drag, pinch, zoom, twist, whatever, multi-tap, 3 fingers, 4 fingers, all those kind of things, all have event handlers attached to them. You start to think about this. Wow, if I can attach an event handler to something, and then that event handler allows me to trigger JavaScript code, what kind of stuff could I do? Well, there's a whole lot that you could do, real frankly. So they give an example here of adding an actual event handler directly to an HTML object. This would be called inline JavaScript. And once again, I did tell you this, right? Not recommended generally to do this, but you can, right? So this is kind of legacy kind of approaches. But here we have a link, right, that takes you to some sort of a home page. It should be called index.html or whatever. We just throw in the event handler as basically an attribute on the element. And we just say onMouseOver, an alert box would come up and say, click, go to home. Now this is an image, so I can't copy paste this, but I could show you this in code really quick. I'm not a fan of this, by the way, but they're doing something like this. On mouse over, I'm just letting this complete the code for me. I can trigger any JavaScript code I want. So for example, one of the few that we've learned so far is the alert, right? And then inside here, in this case, I would use single quotes, not double quotes. I would say, hey, this is cool-ish, whatever. So I'm going to save this. This is on this is on the thank you page. Not a good place to put it. Let's put it somewhere else. Let's put it on the, let's go back to the about page. It's a good place to put it. Okay. So I'm going to save this. Let's go back to our browser where we have a live view of this page. So I'm going to refresh. We already have the alert on there, right? So you guys know what the alert does. But notice, where did I add that? I added it to the home page. So when I do this hover effect, like I do here, you notice I have my little fade in effect too. But the moment I do the home one, it's also going to trigger an alert box. Watch. Pretty cool, I think. Right? But now I have a thing I got to click out of the way. But, I've just basically taught you how to create annoying web pages, right? But there are pages that are like this. And in fact, maybe you could think of a practical use for this one, like, hey, here's a members only page, and you click to go to it. It's like, hey, you got to be a member first. Click OK. All right, so you got to sign up first. But that's an example of an inline JavaScript. Highly not recommended, right? You're better off writing code like this to do it. But people still do it, right? But that's my take on it. All right. So they have an example of that just to really show kind of like the event handling part of it. But usually we would write separate JavaScript code to handle something like that. Now, one of the kind of things that's kind of interesting about JavaScript is when you learn how to program other programming languages and you're using higher level tools and you write code and then you write code that's incorrect, what are your higher level tools do? They underline, they highlight things in red, and they might even make suggestions on how to fix it. And if you're using a tool like Notepad++, well, that's not going to happen. That's why I did the whole WebStorm thing with you guys to suggest, right? You will notice that what's kind of fascinating here is if I start writing JavaScript code, notice how this kind of has a little bit of IntelliSense that's helping me out here, right? To do that, or if I have an error, and I'm trying to make an error, it should highlight this. But this is kind of interesting because this is inside a script tag, so you notice it's not really debugging. So one of the reasons, we talk about this next little section here is one of the biggest debugging tools that you have basically is the console in your browser. So like if you got bad code, you're going to get error messages like this, and so if you have problems with your JavaScript code, your browser becomes your debugger, so this becomes kind of one of your main tools. If you're using a tool like WebStorm that has a built-in debugger, it will do that debugging right inside the product before you get to the browser. If you don't use a tool like that, then the browser becomes the debugger. I think this is interesting. Now, it also tells you a little bit about how JavaScript works. JavaScript works inside your browser. I don't have to install any special software. It's already included, right? So there's no JavaScript library download. There's nothing like that. It's just built into the browser. Do all browsers have a JavaScript engine? Yes, right? And so for a lot of this, when we start to think about it in that capacity, that the debugger is built into the console of your browser, that's really sort of super cool because there's no special extra tools you really have to download, but I still recommend a better IDE if you can. JavaScript has a lot of rules like programming languages do. And we're not like going to spend our whole time kind of learning about that stuff because that takes weeks, right? So we just have like hours basically. But what we do is when you write any programming language, what you figure out is that there's a syntax you have to follow. JavaScript is case sensitive. So there's a difference between upper and lower case of the naming of something. Especially when you name objects. But if you're using built-in features, you have to use the right upper or lower case. If you're naming objects, you have to be consistent with your naming and usage. One little example they give here, once again, is sort of like being able to look at the error messages and then understanding what they mean, right? And then where to look at it. What's kind of fun about these is you ever do look at the console for an error message, it'll tell you what file it's in, where the problem is, and then the line number and column number. So this is line number 10, column number 2 in the document. So we know which document, what line to look on, and what spot in that line to look on to find the error. And that's pretty typical here. So let me see if I can get that back to normal size. When we start to work with, JavaScript, and I don't know if this is coming in as an image again, but otherwise, here's some sample code. So like what I could do in my browser is I could demonstrate some of this stuff for you, but you can do this yourself as well. But what's fun about the console tool, right, is I can declare a variable called, whatever. There's my variable. Then it says it's undefined, but I can say, well, now that it's defined, I can say whatever equals, hey, what's up, right, as a string. And then I can actually document.write that variable. What's the variable's name? Whatever. And then I'm not even putting semicolons at the end here, and it's still working. Yeah, see, it says undefined. So really what I have to do is I have to repeat this line because I didn't write it correctly. All right. And now if I repeat this line, or did it work both times? Yeah, it actually put it on the screen either way. And it kind of shows you how much JavaScript doesn't care, right? It did actually write it both times. But you can do that in JavaScript. So you can write a series of commands, and you don't have to write one command at a time. You can write 5 commands at once. So for example, if I come up with a new variable and call it, ice cream, right? And I can set that worth chocolate, semicolon. Then I can take ice cream and change it to something else like vanilla, semicolon. And then I want to basically put that on the screen. I can do my document.write, and then I can put the variable name inside here. So I can just say ice cream, close it, and it puts it on the screen. So you see what happened there is I created it, and then you can drop entire blocks of code in here too. So you can kind of play with JavaScript a little bit, inside the console, and kind of get a feel for how it works. All right. All right. So we learned how to do an alert box already, which just puts a little box up on the screen, right? And when you put that up on the screen, your only option to get out of it is to click OK. You guys noticed that, right? There's a different kind, which is one called a prompt box. So we're going to try this one too. So I'm going to go back to my code here. I'm going to get rid of this command. So we have an alert, but I'm going to kind of remove this. Now, I don't want to completely delete it. So I'm actually going to put 2 slashes in front of it just to comment out so I can keep it there as an example. But the thing that they're demonstrating here in the PowerPoint is they have a variable equals prompt message. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this operates because it might not make sense just from what we're doing here. So let's just call it my whatever. That's my variable. It's going to hold the value. And then I'm going to put up a prompt box. And the prompt box is going to say something like, enter your name. And it kind of gives you an idea of what a prompt box is. And I don't think I'm missing any other syntax here. That's it. And when I put this up on the screen, and so let's save this back to the browser and refresh. So we need this page. So I'm going to refresh. All right, so here comes the refresh. Here's my prompt now instead of an alert. Now notice the difference. What is it doing? It's prompting me for a value. And so it's asking me to enter my name, right? And then I say, okay. Now I didn't do anything with that name, but I could, this is a variable, mind you, right? So whatever I typed into that box got stored here. So I could do like a script command, and I could put it right here, right below about, and I could do a script This is an example of putting, the JavaScript right in your code. And I can do document dot write, and then I can output, well, whatever the person typed into that box. And so, for example, if you're asking for their name, you might inside here say something like, well, let's make a paragraph. So I'm going to make a paragraph tag. And then I'm going to say, hello, space, comma, space. And then we'll put the person's name. So I'm going to put in a plus sign. And then what was the name of that variable? My whatever. And maybe here, let's do this, my name. Because that makes more sense, right? And then we would add my name here, and then we would close the paragraph tag like this. And so I want you to think about this. This content, if I load the web page normally, would not come up. But if the person fills out that box, right, and says okay to it, the name's going to come up right here in this spot, right below the about thing. So I'm going to save this. All right, so here comes the refresh. I'm going to get prompted for my name. Here's my name. Say okay, and there it is on the page. So it captured it from the box and then injected the content onto the page. I do want you to notice that I think this is interesting. With these prompt boxes, I can enter something in or I can cancel. And then if I cancel, it's null, right? And so then I could write code to compensate for that. So like if they don't enter anything, put something, hello, web visitor, something like that. So you can write JavaScript code that dynamically reacts. So this is very, very primitive examples, but we saw both the alert box, which just puts a message on the screen automatically, or the prompt box, which allows you to enter information and send it back to the application. And then we used that information to put something on the screen. Right. All right, so those are kind of, I think, a little simplistic, in terms of like what JavaScript can do, but it should, I'm hoping, right, like kind of go, oh wow, what could I do with this, right? I'm hoping that's the kind of thinking. And here's the cool thing about JavaScript. Once you see the capabilities of what JavaScript can do, oh my God, you can do just like anything you can imagine. So now it's your imagination that's holding you back, not the tools, right? So I think that's really cool. When you do start to learn a programming language, right, and JavaScript is a programming language, you start to deal with all the issues of a programming language. Well, case sensitivity, how is a statement correctly created, that kind of thing. But you can also do math. So there's math operators, very typical, right? We also have comparison operators so that we can write statements where we're checking, for example, if something is equivalent to something, and then if it is, run code that works with it, or greater than, less than, not equal to, etc. We also have the capability, like other programming languages, to write if-else statements or selection statements. So I can write conditional code. So I can say like, if, user's name is Takis, right? Celebrate, else, run for the hills or whatever. Right? So you can write programming code. You can also create your own functions. So you can write blocks of code that have certain actions. So for example, I could write a function that says, if user entered their name, display a welcome message. If they didn't, don't, right? Just leave that off, right? So that would be a thing you could do. Whenever you do create a function, what's kind of interesting here, a function is basically a named block of code. When you only put one action in there, you don't really see the reason for why to do that. But if you had like 20 actions you were taking and it was complicated logic, I can call upon all of those actions with one name. And notice when you name a function, parentheses go after, and when you call it, you include the parentheses. It shows you it's a function or a method, depending on your inclusion. And then sometimes you put stuff in those parentheses and sometimes you don't. But to call a function to run, typically, all you need is its name with the parentheses. If it requires a value to operate, you put that value inside. All right. Historically, when we've done JavaScript, one of the things we used to teach really heavily is to use JavaScript to validate information that you put on a form. Like, so if you look at like my sample site, like this is a form, right? And if you're gathering information from people, what are you doing with it? So here's a real common thing that happens. So you create a form on a website, people type in their stuff, and then once it clears this form, it then gets sent somewhere, and where it might get sent is to a server script or program that operates and then takes that information and puts it into a file or puts it into a database. And if you guys have ever worked with a database, you'll know that one of the things about a database is databases are very finicky about what information you enter into which field. So for example, if you have a zip code field, which is a number, and you type your name into it, you could, you're not going to break the database, but it's not going to let you put it in, right? A database will probably stop you. Unfortunately, when we're working on the web, the database isn't in your browser, it's on the server somewhere out on the internet. So we need to take that information from the form and validate that it's okay, that it's the right kind of information before we put it in the database. So JavaScript has kind of this historical position of like, hey, okay, so we need your first name and last name. Well, you didn't enter either one. Can you please do that? You left your name empty. We need that. Or maybe you're joining a email newsletter list. Well, the email is kind of important. Hey, you forgot to fill that out. Or we might even look at the email and say, is it in the right format? Etc. So JavaScript historically has been one of those things that we've used. Here's a really simple example of a validation script. So for example, if we were looking at, let's say the username from the form was the first form on a field, that would be an index position 0, kind of a long discussion here. But if they left that blank, then you put a message on the screen, the field name cannot be empty, and then you return false. And then you react to the false programmatically by asking them to put it on the screen again, for example. Or what a lot of people do is, like, if you forget to fill out a form field, they like highlight it in red and say, please fill this out, that type of thing. So very common usage of JavaScript. What has happened though, and this is really important to note, is when we look at HTML5, we've also kind of done this thing in HTML5 where we've done things like this, where we've added basically what is an HTML5 attribute that also forces validation. Now, it's not the same as JavaScript, so it's not JavaScript running here that's doing this. It's just built into the API of HTML5, and it's saying, well, the name field's required. So if we don't have this, we're not going to process the form. And so when you see that in a live browser view, so if I don't fill this in and then hit subscribe, you notice what it does, right? It says, please fill out this field. And that's generated by the HTML attribute, not by JavaScript. JavaScript can also act the same way. And the validation script I just showed you would be a way to trigger that. But you can see how just putting required on a form field is a whole lot easier than writing a bunch of JavaScript, because this is just step one of the JavaScript. There's like a couple other steps you have to have, like what's your error message going to be? What are you going to put on the screen? How are you going to fix it? And when are you going to like reabsorb it, right? So that's one of the things historically we would do with JavaScript. What a lot of clever programmers do is they combine both the HTML5 form validation, like with the required thing or like a format or whatever that they're using, with JavaScript, so that before any information ever gets transmitted to the server, we know it's okay. So that way, when the server receives it, we don't crash the server or the program on the server. From a real practical standpoint, from very technical standpoint, why we do a lot of form validation and we do it in the browser is because if the browser can make sure that the information is correct, then I'm saving, clock cycles on my server. My server doesn't have to process that. So it's a faster user experience for the user, and my server works better, right? If I send bad information to the server and the server processes it, and then it sends back a message saying, hey, that was all wrong, you got to do it again. That's really frustrating. It's a lot easier that if your browser does it, right? But if you can clear all those different layers of validation, HTML5, JavaScript on the page, server-side validation, then when we send stuff to a database, where databases are completely unforgiving, if it's expecting a 5-digit number, then that's what it has to be, but it's already validated that it's correct. So it just goes in there and the database is okay, right? So it's all about data integrity ultimately. JavaScript has got a lot of different uses, but one thing that's really kind of interesting about JavaScript is the way that people think about it, and for you guys as kind of like new web programming people, you really don't have the programming part of a web application until JavaScript is in the mix, because that's what makes pages do stuff and sophisticated things. And you're building pages that go beyond just sitting there. They interact with the user, they can do math, you can code games in JavaScript, right? And write full-blown applications in JavaScript. JavaScript, so they have some tips here, right? It says, don't expect JavaScript to always function for every visitor. Okay, so why? Because it's possible to go into your browser settings and turn JavaScript off, right? That makes for a horrible web experience, by the way, because just about every major website has JavaScript on every page. There's some sort of JavaScript running. Right. So some people can turn that off, and in the old days, people would actually get paranoid about this and turn JavaScript off because they thought, like, if they're getting pop-ups and stuff, that's a virus. Folks, it's not, right? So if you disable JavaScript, you're really kind of asking for a lot of problems as you're surfing the web and using the web. JavaScript is our primary tool for also reading and writing cookies and stored information on your computer, which a lot of websites also use. Another thing to think about is, if you're writing a lot of JavaScript that interacts with the screen, you might have people that can't use a mouse. That's kind of a weird thought, but it's true. Disabled people use the web, blind people use the web, deaf people use the web, people that are hard of seeing or whatever, different languages may use the web. So it's something to think about in how you operate. Okay, so you got this issue, like if you do have a lot of JavaScript on your page, what happens if a person visits your page and they don't have JavaScript enabled, or they have a really crappy old browser? Very, very, very unlikely. By the way, most people leave it on, but it's possible. So you might want to have like fallbacks for stuff that JavaScript puts on the screen. So if JavaScript is putting an image on the screen and they have JavaScript turned off and that image isn't showing, you better have a backup in place, is what they're recommending. I will tell you very frankly, these days in modern programming for the web, I kind of don't worry about this too much, because I would just have one blanket statement that says, hey, JavaScript is required for this web page. Don't have it turned on, you're going to have problems. Really, JavaScript should be turned on in a browser. It really does not create a lot of security issues in any way, shape, or form. All right, folks, now we're going into kind of like the last little section here, and then we're going to kind of wrap up the lecture portion of today. And once you learn how to do JavaScript and you learn how it operates and what it can do, you very quickly become acquainted to this really important JavaScript library called jQuery. jQuery is really what it is formally is a library that you add to your project. So you can either download it from the jQuery website and then upload it to your own folders, or what a lot of people do is they just link to either Google's version of it or the jQuery website version of it. So you're using their online repositories. And then once you have that linked up, you can use all the commands that are built into jQuery which make JavaScript work a whole lot easier. So why do we use jQuery? All right. A lot of it is visual, real frankly. So this technology was actually originally developed by the people at Google. Pushing on 20 years ago now. So it got really popular about 15 years ago, when everybody was watching Google kind of explode and take everything over, and they were like, how are they doing this? How are they developing everything so quickly? And their answer was jQuery. So like they would have all this stuff that you could do that was kind of like, hey, hide this, show this, move this, animate this. Here's a link, change the CSS, make this action happen. And jQuery was like the magic sauce. And instead of having these really complicated like things of JavaScript that might be 10, 20 lines long, it was all condensed down to a line or two with a simple command. And so it became very appealing for people. So a real common way to link up to jQuery, this is what I was mentioning before, is you just throw this in. And of course, this is going to be version number dependent. This is kind of an older version, but whatever. You basically link to the Google APIs for jQuery because they are the originators of this. So we usually link up to Google. And then when you write a jQuery command, it kind of looks like this. When you look at JavaScript code, whenever you see a $sign at the beginning of a statement, that's jQuery, right? And then we're using their function. Real standard one to add to all jQuery code is the document ready function. And basically what this one does is when the page loads, run this jQuery. Sometimes you have stuff in here, sometimes you don't, but typically like anything you want to happen on a page would go inside the document ready function, as we call it. Here's how you do an alert inside of jQuery. Now you're going to say like, well, hold on a second. How is this any better, right? Because really what's happening is the outer statement is jQuery, the inner statement is JavaScript. And yeah, you can intermingle the two. Weird, very weird. All right, but this isn't really a great example. So this will still put an alert box on the screen. I don't really see much of a gain here. But if you do something like this, where I have, instead of saying alert, I could say hide. This is just an example. And then I put in my CSS selector and I can hide something on the page. Well, with JavaScript, that takes a lot of code. With jQuery, it's one command attached either to a class, an ID, or a CSS tag selector. And wow, all of a sudden it's like, well, now I see it, right? And then that's why I think this is not a great first example to show. So a lot of it you will learn with jQuery is really based around the same kind of CSS selectors that you use in doing CSS. So once you learn CSS, jQuery is really easy to learn. So if I use a star, it applies to everything on the page. If I want to put jQuery on a list item or a class or an ID, you see the syntax is really super easy. And then what would follow the $sign and the selector would be your action. So it might be like hide, show, animate, that kind of thing, all built in there. There's whole fields of study on this. This is not something I would expect you to figure out really quick. But the thing is, you use the selector in combination with a method or a thing, right? So for example, if I have a paragraph and I click on it, this would trigger an action that you want to click with. Or I can change the CSS of an object with jQuery, or I can fade something out and hide it, or show it, or hover, or whatever. And so like a more complete jQuery statement might look like this. You have your ready function, and then you have another jQuery statement where we're attaching it to a CSS selector of an anchor tag. And when people click, we trigger this action that any even list item will receive the CSS color of green, right? And so this is 0, 1, 2, that's how it numbers it. And so that would be the result. So that jQuery. So this is a little bit more well-formed, but it shows you like what you can do. So now if you think about like what you might have to do otherwise to make this happen, Well, I would have to write my list item. I would have to put a maybe a class on it, and then I might have to give it an ID, and then I would have to write some CSS code. And if there's two different IDs or whatever, you know, it's like you're writing all this code to make something happen, where jQuery here steps in and without writing any different CSS at all, changes the color of something, and it's like, oh wow, okay, that's cool. I didn't have to write a lot of code to do it. That's kind of the advantage of doing this. Another one, for example, is the toggle method, right? Where you write in this thing, like for example, this little snippet here that says more might have an ID of more attached to it. So whenever I click on it, it triggers the toggle function, which shows the rest of the content. That's done with jQuery, you know, super, super easy to write. So in other words, this would be put on the page, right? And the CSS for it would be display none. And then when I hit more, this toggles it to visible. I think that's really cool. That's really, really cool stuff. If you look at the case studies for chapter 14, they show you, for example, how to switch that like weird gallery thing they were showing you. Here's an image gallery, really primitive one, mind you. So you could follow something like this if you were curious about doing it, done with jQuery. And this is way, way easier than coding it with JavaScript, and way easier than some of the other approaches that you learned, and super lightweight, works really, really well, by the way. Just remember that if you ever use jQuery, you can get the plugins, so you can, like, once again, add it to your website, like download the files, add them to your folder structure. Right? So that's one approach. Or you use the Google approach where you just simply link to it. You will find, I think, generally speaking, that most coders will tend to do it that way, is link to the external. All right, folks,